So that's my public service announcement, my warning for people. Abandon hope, all who enter here, I think as Dante said. Again, our share Tuesday morning is sponsored for the entire year by Rev. Raphael and Sharon Auman in memory of their parents, Edith and Rainer Auman, Yona Ben Tzadok. Yeah. Having trouble here. And Esther Bas Raphael and their son, Rav Shmuel Eliyahu Auman, Rav Shmuel Eliyahu Ben Rav Raphael. Again, we're very, very grateful with Hachazakas Torah. May the zechus of supporting Torah be le'iloi nishmatam. Okay, so last week we began discussing the mitzvah Birkat Hamazon, because it was in the parsha 2 weeks ago, but now we're going to branch out a little bit into a broader aspect of the Birkat Hamazon. I had mentioned that some types of benching are min HaTorah, and some types of benching are midrabanan. So d'oraisa, you're only mechuyev to bench if you eat bread. If you ate what is called kedei sevia, you ate enough bread or enough food that you're fully satisfied. That's a d'oraisa chiyuv, as it says, v'yachalta v'savata. If you eat a kazayas, just the size of an olive, but it doesn't fill you up, so you're still mechuyev to bench, of course, but the chiyuv of benching is midrabanan. It is a drabanan dika chiyuv, but it's not a chiyuv d'oraisa. And then, as I mentioned, there is a machlokes. What do we mean by kedei sevia? Do we mean you ate enough bread that you would be satisfied? Or does it mean that the bread with the other food? Because b'derech klal, if a person is having a meal, he's not going to eat enough bread that will fill him up on the bread, because then he loses the benefit of the meal. So if you define kedei sevia, that it has to be kedei sevia of the lechem itself, it would actually turn out that probably the majority of meals, the chiyuv of Birkat Hamazon would not be deraisa, because people will eat less bread to have more, whatever it is they want to eat. So that's something to think about. Now, before I go further, let's branch out a little bit and talk about something that's very relevant to this parsha. What is exactly the concept of rabbinic chiyuvim? Rabbinic chiyuvim. I mean, after all, the Torah itself says, lo saisif, don't add to the Torah. Don't subtract from the Torah. Okay, don't subtract, we understand. God says do something, you don't subtract from it. But adding from the Torah is also prohibited. And again, indeed, as Chazal say, kol hamosif goreya. Anyone who adds ultimately comes to subtract. The raya is from Adam Harishon. Adam Harishon was told by Hashem not to eat from the Eitz Hadas. He communicated to Chava, don't touch it. Kli Yakar says he didn't trust his wife. So he told her, he made a fence around the Torah, but he didn't tell her it was a fence. He said, this is what God said. What did the Nachash do? The Nachash pushed her against the tree. She touched it. Nothing happened. So she figured that God's commandments weren't going to be valid. In other words, Kol HaMaisif. Who's the Maisif here? Adam Harishon. By Adam Harishon adding to Hashem's commandments, there was a Gira'on. So the question is, what is the source of rabbinic authority? Well, first of all, who are the rabbis? I'll get to that. That's an important question. I mean, I can assure you I cannot make a gezerah or takana on Klal Yisrael, so we'll discuss that. But putting aside the who for a moment, what is the source of the koach of the chachamim to make gezeros, to make takanos? So the Rambam, based on the Gemara in Shabbos, actually finds it in this parsha. The Torah says that when you have a difficulty, you go to the Sanhedrin, and it says, Al pi atayra asher yarucha, according to the guidance that they give you, v'ala mishpat asher yaimer lecha tasa, what they tell you to do, lo sasor mikol asher yagidu lecha yamin usmo. Do not turn away from what they tell you to the right or to the left. There's a chiyuv d'oraisa to obey the decisions of the Sanhedrin on matters of halacha. Says the Rambam in the Sefer HaMitzvos and also in Hilchos Mamrim that this is the chiyuv d'oraisa to obey the gezeros and the takanos of the chachamim. A little vocabulary. What is the difference between a gezerah and a takana? So a gezerah is the proverbial fence around the Torah that the Chachamim make. So they say, for example, you're not allowed to eat chicken in milk, lest you confuse it and you come to eat meat and milk. D'oraisa, it is only meat and milk. Chicken is not considered to be meat for this purposes because it is only a mammal that produces milk. That's called meat. Right? You're only fleshik if you're also milchik, meaning to say, d'oraisa, the definition of meat is a milk-producing animal, a mammal. But the Chachamim asur chicken because people confuse chicken with meat. So that's called the gezerah, a fence around the Torah. Muktzah is another example. All of these categories of things that you're not supposed to move on Shabbos. By the way, move, not touch. You can touch muktzah, actually. The prohibition of muktzah is moving it. Again, more or less, there are a number of reasons, but one of the reasons for muktzah is because the types of things that are muktzah are usually the types of things you're not allowed to use on Shabbos, like a pen or a pencil. So what's the fear? If I could move the pen, I might come to use it. So this is called a gezerah, and this is called a fence around the Torah. Now, takana is a different type of rabbinic enactment. That is not to prevent violation of a prohibition, but it's simply an enactment for a positive benefit. An example, lighting Hanukkah candles is a takana of the Chachamim to commemorate a miracle. Even Megillah Esther, reading Megillah. Even though it's in the Tanakh, but since it's after the Zman of Moshe Rabbeinu, it's Drabanan, meaning anything, any halacha that is created after Moshe Rabbeinu's time, after Matan Torah, is, in fact, I shouldn't even say after Moshe Rabbeinu's time. Moshe Rabbeinu himself made takanos. For example, the chiyuv of reading the Torah on Shabbos is a takana of Moshe Rabbeinu. It's not d'oraisa, which means there are some d'rabbanans that may be as old as d'oraisas. In fact, there may be some d'rabbanans that are older than d'oraisas, because Moshe Rabbeinu may have gotten mitzvahs from Hashem after he made. We don't know exactly when he made the takana. Okay, so if you actually looked at Judaism, and if you were a Karaite, and you would try to exclude all the Rabbanans, you would be quite astounded how much of our religion is based on Rabbanans. So says the Rambam, he who violates a takana or a gezerah of the Rabbanan transgresses the negative commandment of Lo Sasor, and as well, he is not mekayem the mitzvah saseh of al pi TORAH asher yorucha, that you shall follow the Torah. And the Rambam brings a raya. Again, it's based on Gemara and Shabbos. The Rambam brings a raya that every drabanan is a d'oraisa from the bracha that we recite. Let's take Hanukkah candles. What do you say? You say, Baruch atah Hashem Elokeinu melech haolam, asher kiddishanu b'mitzvosav v'tzivanu lahadlik ner shel Chanukah. Blessed art you, Hashem, who has commanded us with his mitzvos to light Hanukkah candles. Where did God say that we have to light Hanukkah candles? The whole miracle of Hanukkah was more than 1,000 years after the Torah was given. And certainly, every future event is alluded to in the Torah, but there's certainly no mitzvah called thou shalt light Hanukkah candles. In fact, that's a whole kasha. The Bahag, the Baal Hilchos Gedolos, actually counts Hadlakas Ner Chanukah as a mitzvah saseh min Torah. And the Rambam himself says, where on earth is there a mitzvah to light Hanukkah candles? But the Rambam's answer is, there is a mitzvah to light Hanukkah candles in a generic sense, since there's a mitzvah de'oraisa to obey the takanos and gezeros of the Chachamim, based on the pasuk Lo Sasor Mikach Argidu Lecha. So every d'Rabbanan becomes a d'oraisa, and in fact, based on that idea, some d'Rabbanans might be more chamor, because a d'Rabbanan has both a lav and an aseh. Lo Sasor and al pi ateret yerucha. There are other prohibitions that only have a lav; they don't have an aseh. So actually, a d'Rabbanan could be more chamor than a d'oraisa. So this is the famous shita of the Rambam, that every isur d'Rabbanan, if it's a gezerah, it's an isur, a prohibition, and every chiyuv d'Rabbanan, if it's a takana like Kriyas HaTorah, if you violate them, you are transgressing a mitzvah de'oraisa, because the Torah itself requires that you obey the decision of the Chachamim. Now, the Rashba explains, although it's a little circular in some ways, that this is why there's no Aveira of adding to the Torah, because you could ask, how could the Rabbanan make Takanos and Gezeros? L'chaira, you are adding to the Torah. The answer is no, you're not adding to the Torah, because the Torah itself gives them the authority to do it. I mean, in a way, it's an interesting thing. The authority is inferred from the prohibition, meaning you actually don't have a pasuk that directly says the Chachamim have the authority to make takanas. But if the Torah says, thou shalt listen to the takanos and gezeros, implicit in the obligation to listen is the authority to make those rules. You see? Now, the Rashba also says let me hold back in that for a moment. Now, the Rambam articulates this in the Sefer HaMitzvos, right? In the Sefer HaMitzvos, in which he says, he's explaining he is not going to count every rabbinic decree as a separate commandment. Because if you were to count every rabbinic decree as a separate commandment, you wouldn't just have 613 mitzvahs, you would have 5,000 mitzvahs. So the Rambam says, I'm not going to count each specific rabbinic decree as a mitzvah. I'm going to count a single mitzvah called thou shalt listen to the Chachamim. And that includes a million different, just like Shabbos. Again, Shabbos is another example. There are 39 prohibitions of work on Shabbos. But we don't count Shabbos as 39 prohibitions. We don't say, when we count the 613 mitzvahs, we don't say, thou shalt not cook, thou shalt not write, thou shalt not harvest. Because once again, if you start doing that, you're going to have way more than 613, you see? What you do is you count one mitzvah. Do not do malacha. We then say malacha includes 39 things. So whether I cook or whether I write, I am transgressing the identical negative commandment, lo sasa bo malacha. And understand that concept. There is no lav, there is no prohibition of not cooking, not writing. There's a prohibition of not doing malacha, which includes 39 things. Well, the Rambam says rabbinic law is identified in the same way. We don't have specific mitzvos, light Hanukkah candles, read Megillah, read the Torah. We have one mitzvah, lav and an asay, listen to the Chachamim. And that's why the Rambam is cholek on the Bahag, because the Bahag, one of the Gaonim, the Hilchos Gedolos, who wrote an earlier, in fact, the Bahag may have been the very first person who tried to enumerate. You understand, the Chachamim tell us there are 613 mitzvahs, that's a Gemara. But they don't give you a listing. So if you have some time, if you ever have time, go through a Chumash, write down every commandment of God in the Torah. You could even say, Vayomer Elokim Yehi Or. God said, let there be light, and that's a command too. You'd actually have a lot of problems. How do you get this? In other words, it's a much harder process than you might think. How do you get 613? You seem to have much, much more than 613 and the like. So the concept of what's called minyan ha-mitzvos, trying to enumerate the mitzvos and explaining why these count and why these don't count, is actually something that the Gaonim and the Rishonim spent a lot of time on. They spent a lot of time on. Rav Sadia Gaon wrote a Sefer HaMitzvos. But the earliest was the anonymous Gaon who's known as the Hilchos Gedolos. We don't really know. Some say it's Rav Shimon Kayara. Others say we don't know who he is. And he's called Bahag. Bahag just means Baal, the author of Hilchos Gedolos. And to a large extent, the Rambam Sefer HaMitzvos was a response and a critique of the Baal Hilchos Gedolos, who was his predecessor. And the Rambam is the one who really developed counting mitzvos into a science. Because not only did the Rambam enumerate, the Rambam gave you criteria, rules for what you count, what you don't count. In other words, he is the first and almost the only one who scientifically wanted to give you rules of inclusion, exclusion, and the like. Now, in the Sefer HaMitzvos, where the Rambam critiques the Bahag for counting all the Rabbanon separately, and the Rambam says they are Doraisa, but they're Doraisa under Loisasor. So the Ramban, Nachmanides, the great Gadol of the next generation, I mean, their lives overlapped a little bit, but the Rambam died when the Ramban was still very young. The Ramban wrote a huge critique on the Sefer HaMitzvos of the Rambam. So if you get a Sefer HaMitzvos of the Rambam, there are a lot of commentaries, but you'll see that you have the Rambam in the middle, and then you have the Ramban on the side. And I think I had mentioned, maybe even last week, I don't remember, that the Ramban also says that the Rambam left out certain mitzvos. The most famous example is Yishuv Eretz Yisrael, that the Ramban, Nachmanides, counts living in Eretz Yisrael as a mitzvah d'oraisa. The Rambam does not count. Different things. The Ramban says that, now, of course, you understand the problem with the 613. This is the classic zero-sum game. Because if you're wedded to the magic number 613, and then you even break it down further, that it's 248 positives and 365 negative, well, if Rambam already gave us 613, and Ramban, let's say, is adding Yishuv Eretz Yisrael, you got an immediate problem, because that's going to put you up to 614. So you understand that the way this process works is every time you add, you must subtract an equivalent number. So the Ramban figures it out. The Ramban basically says it's like trying to stuff everything into a limited area. If I'm going to add this one, I got to take some other one and consider it to be subordinate to a larger category. Like everything has to work out. Now, the Ramban does discuss theoretically, hey, is 613 an article of faith? Meaning, the Torah comes from God. Okay, the Torah comes from Hashem, of course. But who says I got to say there's 613? What's so bad if I count 615 or 700 or 800? Am I wedded? Because what's the makor? What is the source? Again, excuse the digression, but I just want to give this as part of a background. We'll come back to the main topic in a few minutes. What is the source that the Torah has 613 commandments? It's not from the Torah itself. God does not say explicitly, behold, I'm giving you 613 commandments. What is the source? The source is a brisa at the end of Maseches Makos. Not that many references. One Talmudic reference, in which a drasha was made that God gave Moshe Rabbeinu, God gave 613 mitzvos, and the proof is from the verse, Torah tziva lanu Moshe. Moshe gave us Torah. And Torah is a gematria. So the Gemara asks right away, well, close but no cigar. Torah, bigematria, is 611. 400, and Vav is 406, Resh, 606, Hey, another 5, 611. So how can you say 613, 611? So the Gemara's answer is, Hashem, right, Moshe gave us 611 mitzvahs, because 2 mitzvahs we heard directly from Hashem. Torah tziva lanu Moshe. But which 2 mitzvahs do we hear from Hashem? The first of the 2 dibros. The first 2 of the dibros. Anochi Hashem Elokecha, I am the Lord your God. And number 2, you shall not have any other gods. And then we got afraid, and we begged Moshe to be the intermediary, and Moshe was the intermediary. And then it goes on, and the Brisa says, there are 248 thou shalt do, mitzvah taseh, and that is connected the bones of a person, that each mitzvah gives life in a spiritual sense to a bone. And then there are 365 thou shalt not do, that if you violate, there is a pagam, a detriment in the sinews. You have 365 ligaments or sinews. We don't mean you'll get arthritis. These are not physical things, but the spiritual essence gets impaired. Now the Gemara doesn't really tell me which mitzvah is connected which bone, and which negative commandment is connected which sinew. There actually are later svarim that try to correlate them in that way. But the point that the Ramban makes is that this is a drash. This is an interpretation offered by a rabbi. In fact, it's a named person. So who says we're mechuyev as an article of faith that we're stuck, if that's the right word, with 613? So that's very fascinating. If somebody were to give a drasha today, who says there's 613 mitzvahs in the Torah, he would be an apikoros. They would put him in chayrim and everything else. In fact, it may happen to me now, I don't know. But the thing is, the Ramban actually was very, very willing to say that maybe 613 is lav davka, and that would make life a lot easier, because when you add different mitzvahs, you don't have to figure out how to subtract them. But even though the Ramban was willing to consider this as a possibility, at the end he says, but this is the tradition of Klal Yisrael. It's better not to disregard traditions. He also brings other midrashim. It's not just the Gemara in Makos. It's also Shirash, a medrash. Okay, even then, it's still only an isolated medrash. So he says he is going to work with the assumption that there are 613. So whenever he adds a mitzvah, he's going to subtract. Okay. So here, though.
What about Pardes?
Say again?
Pardes, it's 13 Pardes, the gematria of it.
Is Pardes 613? Is that correct?
I'm asking, I think it is.
No, it's not. It's not. It's less than that. Pei is 80, Reish is 280, and Dalet is 284 plus 60. So it's much less than, It's not Pardes. Pardes are the 4 levels of Torah learning.
Right.
We have Pshat, Remez, Drush, Sod.
So the Ramban was connected more to...
Well, it's true. The Ramban was connected to Kabbalah.
That's shot, I think.
No, that's very true, but that's a separate. I think that's a separate issue. That's not connected to the 613 in and of itself. By the way, it's an interesting thing. Just as a little aside, Chazal, or at least this Gemara, correlates the mitzvos to the human body. 248 are my bones, and 365 are my sinews, meaning my ligaments, my tendons. Which means, on some level, if you're missing a mitzvah, there'll be some spiritual deformity in the bone, whatever that means exactly. You do an aveira, you transgress a negative commandment, there's going to be a pegima in a ligament. So here we have a very simple question. There has never been a Jew in the history of the world, no matter how big a tzaddik, who could keep all 613 mitzvahs of the Torah. It's impossible. Some are only for Kohanim and not for non-Kohanim. Some are for men and not for women. Some are for women and not for men. Many of them, of course, only apply in Eretz Yisrael, and many of them only apply when there's a Beis HaMikdash. Now, if it would simply be a question, okay, I can't do it, so I'm putter. I mean, that's not a problem per se. But if you're correlating it to the body, that means HaKadosh Baruch Hu has set up a system where by definition you will be spiritually defective no matter how righteous you are. That seems to be unfair. Meaning it may not be intrinsically unfair that I can't do a mitzvah, because never, if I can't do it. But once you're correlating it to my spiritual mitzias, then the chayra, God set everybody up for failure. Everybody. And even when there's a Beis HaMikdash, you're set up for failure, because there'll be many, many mitzvahs that if I'm not a Kohen, I can't do in the Beis HaMikdash and the like. So how is it shayach? How is it possible for someone to be able to have the Taryag mitzvos if they're not able to keep them? So there's actually 2 terutzim that are given to this question. Teretz number 1 is, this is one of the reasons why Talmud Torah is so important. Talmud Torah allows me, not only is learning intrinsically important, but Talmud Torah allows me to get the spiritual light of a commandment, even though I'm not able to keep it. Now, Chazal say this explicitly by korbanos. He who learns the korbanos is as if they brought a korban. But it applies to everything. In fact, that's why there's a special importance, as counterintuitive as this sounds, in learning those parts of the Torah that I'm unable to keep. Now, logically, and indeed halachically this is true, it's more important to learn the parts of the Torah that are relevant to your life. Laws of Shabbos, laws of Kashrus, because I have to know how to live as a Jew. But people sometimes disparage learning Vayikra, learning Korbanos, learning about leprosy. It's not nogea to me. The other way around. If those halakim of Torah give light to your bones and to your sinews, and you have no way of doing it, the only way you get that light is by learning. I mean, I'll give you a very simple example. Giving a get. If a man wants to divorce his wife, there's a mitzvah in the Torah that he has to give her a get. Which means it's a mitzvah saseh. It is actually counted as a positive commandment in the Torah that upon divorce, a man shall give a get to his wife. Now that must mean there is a get bone in our bodies. I have a get bone. There's some bone. It only gets its life by a get. So, husband comes home one day, says, honey, I really love you, but, listen, I have this get bone in my body. I have to do it. What else can I do? Now, that would be absurd. Well, again, knowing the questions people ask, I wouldn't be surprised if somebody brought up that question. But still...
She'll say, don't get it.
Don't get it, right? Right. But any responsible Rav would tell the guy that he's nuts. I want to divorce my wife because I want to do the mitzvah saseh of get.
But they could remarry.
Well, okay, they could remarry. They could remarry. Although any guy that would do that, I would advise the woman to find somebody else. Once you're free. No, but if he's a Kohen, he can. If he's a Kohen, he can, right? Right. Okay. So here's the thing. If by learning about a mitzvah, you get the light of the mitzvah. So I tell the person, learn the tractate of Gittin. Learn Maseches Gittin. You'll get your get bone. Your get bone will be revived by Maseches Gittin, right? By the way, Maseches Gittin is a very popular tractate in yeshivas. Well, it was last night, right? Last night was the Siyum Daf Yomi in Maseches Gittin. There is, of course, the classic joke, which maybe I shouldn't say. People always ask the question that why is Gittin before Kedushin? Because we finish the tractate of Get, and then we go to marriage. Now, the real reason is, the Rambam writes, because when the Torah describes marriage, it actually describes it after divorce. It says, V'yatsa, when she's divorced, V'hayasa, she then gets married leish acher. So the Torah itself mentions divorce as a precursor to remarriage. So the Mishnah is just following the order of the Chumash. But the old joke, and forgive me, and don't tell my wife, it's a joke, it's only a joke. I don't mean it, I absolutely don't mean it, is that Hashem gives you the refuah before the makkah. Okay. Forgive me, okay. But be it as it may, that's answer number one. So again, the question is, once again, if I need the 613 for spiritual life, how do I get it? If there's mitzvahs I can't do, answer the pathway of Talmud Torah. You say the Brisker Rav, Rav Yitzchak Soloveitchik, Rav Chaim's son, the last Rav of Brisk before the Holocaust, who of course came to Eretz Yisrael after escaping the Warsaw Ghetto, and he was acknowledged by many as the Gadol Hador. I think he died. He either died right before Yom Kippur or the very beginning of Yom Kippur. I mean, he died as they were saying Kol Nidre. I think it was 1960. I think it was. But the Brisker Rav was a misnaged, as you would expect, and the Brisker Rav was not a particular fan of Hasidus at all. But there was one Hasidic Rav that the Brisker Rav befriended, and he showed a lot of kavod to. And this Hasidic Rav didn't even have a large following. He was not a famous Hasidic Rav. Some of the Brisker Rav was Mekarefim. So his Talmidim once asked him, Rebbe, we know that you're not into Hasidus that much. Like, why are you so close to this person, and why are you Mekarefim? Why do you respect him? He says, well, I tell you, people go to Hasidic Rebbes, and they always ask for segulos. I need parnasa, I need a child, I need a shidduch, my child needs to get married, I have a chayla. And Rebbes say, do this, do this. So when people go to this Rebbe, he also has his list of segulos. I need a parnasa. He says, learn Bava Metzia, which is about business. Learn Bava Metzia Be'iyun with the commentaries. I need shidduch for my daughter. Learn Maseches Kedushin. So as a result, he's not a very popular Hasidic Rebbe because his segulos are very hard. They take a lot of work. They take a lot of effort. People want something quick, like a red string or drink this water. You know, they don't want a Rebbe to tell them, oh, learn a whole Maseches of Talmud. But the Brisker Rebbe said, maybe he doesn't have a lot of following, but I'm his chassid. He's my type of Rebbe. The Rebbe that said, in fact, even the Sfas Emes once said a very sharp word. Somebody asked the Sfas Emes, what is the best segula for something? So the Sfas Emes said, in the typical sharp way of Gerech Hasidus, says the best segula is to be Makayim the pasuk Vayisam li segula mikol ha'amim, meaning make yourself a special treasure in Hashem's eyes, meaning live a life of virtue and righteousness. So you become, what does segula mean? A precious treasure. He says the best segula is Vayisam li segula. And again, I'm not here at all to put down segulas. Segulas can be can have their place as augmentations of things, but one has to remember the Iker way. We're approaching Elul, we're approaching Rosh Hashanah. The Iker way that one elicits Hashem's mercy and one elicits the brachos of HaKadosh Baruch Hu is not by tricks and not by gimmicks and not by shortcuts, but it's by our sincerity, by our tshuva, by our masim tovim, by our learning, by our avas Yisrael. These are the things. So these are not shortcuts. These are not quickie things, but they are the things that ultimately count. They say when Rav Shimon Schwab Zichrono Livracha, the great Rav of Washington Heights, actually he was in Baltimore before that, when his granddaughter came back from a year in Eretz Yisrael in seminary, she had a red string around her wrist. The red string that they walk around Kever Rachel, and people like to wear the red string. So he had never heard of that. He just said, what is that? So she said, well, this is a thing. Walk around Kever Rachel, you wear the red string, it protects you from Ayin Hara. So he took, he was a Yeki Taka, but he took a scissors. He says, he cut it off. He says, we don't do that stuff. He says, you want to, a skula, then you say Tehillim, you daven, you give tzedakah, you turn to Hashem, you take on some Kabbalah to do a mitzvah in a better way. Those are the things you do. And the truth is, again, I don't mean to disparage, but the point is, if you're not linking the skula to enhanced mitzvah observance, then you're mamash missing the point. If you do use it as something that encourages you to greater mitzvahs, then maybe it can augment, maybe it can add something. But you can't have the addition without the ikr. There's a tafel and there's an ikr. We always have to be aware of what the ikr is. Okay, so that's the idea of taryag. Now there's a second answer to taryag. How do you get the zechus of taryag? And the second answer is by avas Yisrael. So you may ask, how does avas Yisrael give me the zechus of 613 mitzvahs? So here would be the mashal. When a man in the morning put tefillin on his left arm or his right arm if he's a lefty. So how do you describe that? You don't say, oh, my arm put on tefillin today. It wasn't my arm that put on tefillin. I put on tefillin because my arm is part of me. Right? You don't say my mouth benched. I benched. My mouth is part of me. So the same thing is true in terms of how I view myself in relationship to the rest of the Jewish people. If I truly consider myself one with Klal Yisrael, and I don't regard myself as a separate autonomous entity, and Klal Yisrael itself is an entity that transcends past, present, future, just like your own body, right? There's almost not a single cell in your body that was there 20 years ago. Right? So in a sense, you might say, hey, I'm not the same. I mean, psychologically, I'm talking not the same person, but even physically. In fact, philosophically, this is called the problem of identity. How can I assume I'm the same person? Every part of my body changed. Every cell is different. There's not a cell in my hand that was there 20 years ago. Right? So I'm a different person. interesting criminal defense, right? Right? Maybe send it to Trump. Maybe. So, I'm not the same person I was January 6th, or whatever it is. By the way, it's fascinating that there may be an American president who gets sentenced and he still gets elected to be president. I mean, it would be a nightmare scenario, but it would be a fascinating legal issue, just intellectually, just to contemplate. Now we have in Judaism a precedent. Rabbi Rittenberg, Rav Meir of Rittenberg, was in prison for 7 years, and he continued to have a yeshiva. He continued to have talmidim. He continued to write Chidushei Torah from behind, essentially, a prison. So we do have that precedent of being able to lead even from a prison cell, but it would be very, very interesting, but hopefully that will not happen. Okay, so here's the thing. So with Avas Yisrael, even the mitzvahs I can't do, but I'm part of a body that does them. So the mitzvahs of the women become the mitzvahs of the men. The mitzvahs of the men become the mitzvahs of the women. The mitzvahs that were done 100 years ago, or 1,000 years ago, are my mitzvahs because I'm part of that entity, just like the mitzvahs that I did when I was 13 are my mitzvahs today, even though my cells are totally different. So Avas Yisrael, connecting to Klal Yisrael, is a mechanism where you can have the benefit of taryag, even though you're not able to be Mekayim it. So we have two pathways to this question. One is the pathway of Limud HaTorah, and the other is the pathway of Avas Yisrael. So there's a gewaldige Wort from the Chassan Sofer. The Chassan Sofer was a grandson of the Chassam Sofer. Obviously less well known, but also a chashuva person. He comments on the famous story of Hillel and the non-Jew. Right, a non-Jew went to Shammai first and said, "Teach me the whole Torah al regel achas. Teach me the whole Torah when I'm on one foot." So Shammai thought that the person was mocking, scoffing, and Shammai chased him away. Shammai said, "Get out of here. You're making fun of Yiddishkeit. I don't want to deal with you." By the way, just a little point. Sometimes people have this caricature that Shammai was a grouch. Shammai was mean. I don't want to, go by Shammai's house. He's not going to give me cookies on Halloween or whatever it would be. Keep in mind that the famous teaching in Pirkei Avos, having makabel kol adam b'sever panim yafes, that you must greet everybody in a pleasant way, was said by Shammai. So Shammai's own motto was makabel kol adam b'sever panim yafes. But Shammai had not an unreasonable belief that if this guy is making fun of the Torah, then at that point he needs to get musar. He needs to understand that you don't make fun of Hashem's Torah. Okay. He then went to Hillel. And Hillel gave him an answer. You want to know the whole Torah on one foot? So he said, Madasani lach lechavercha loisiavid. This is Aramaic. And this means, Madasani lach, what is hateful to you, what you wouldn't want people to do to you, do not do to your friend. This is often called the negative golden rule. I'll talk about why did he use the negative. Instead of saying, do unto others as you would want them to do unto you, this is phrased in the negative. Don't do to people what you wouldn't want people to do to you. We'll call that the negative golden rule.
Gold-plated.
Yeah.
It's the gold-plated.
Gold-plated rule? Well, Rabbi Akiva emphasized the positive, but again, Rabbi Akiva is quoting the Torah itself. You should love your neighbor as yourself. I'll talk about that in a moment. But before we get to why Hillel uses the negative rather than the positive, let's ask even a simpler question. That is, how is that the whole Torah? We understand, the Torah has Bein Adam Lamakam, between man and God, and the Torah has between man and man, our relationship with each other. So I can understand how you could summarize between man and man, Bein Adam L'Chaveiro, by saying, be sensitive to people's feelings. Don't hurt them. But the Torah has a whole dimension of Bein Adam Lamakom, putting on tefillin, keeping kosher, not wearing Shabbos, keeping Shabbos. How is that subsumed under the rule, what is hurtful to you, do not do to your friend? At most, Hillel is summarizing maybe half of the Torah, but not the other half. So Rashi says a beautiful comment. Rashi says, when Hillel says, what is hateful and hurtful to you, do not do to your friend. Your friend is not only your fellow human being, your friend is HaKadosh Baruch Hu, who's also called your friend. And just as you wouldn't want people to ignore your feelings and ignore your desires, so don't hurt Hashem, so to speak, by ignoring his desires. A beautiful thought. Hashem is our friend. Now we know Hashem is described in so many different ways. Avinu, he is our parent. Malkeinu, he is our king. He is described as our spouse in Shir HaShirim. Many different levels. And yet, here we see Hashem is described as our friend, our beloved friend. And that's why Hillel's formula picks up not only the Bein Adam Lechavero, it also picks up the Bein Adam Lamakom. Okay, that's the important idea of Hashem being your friend. And Rashi has a pasuk, by the way, that supports that idea. And that is a pasuk in Mishlei, where Shlomo HaMelech says, Re'acha v're'a avicha al ta'azov. Do not abandon your friend, who is the friend of your father. And although in Mishlei everything has pshat and deeper meaning, in Pasuk Pshat, Shlomo HaMelech is actually saying, be faithful to your friends. That actually is what it means in pshat, but the drasha is, Hashem is your friend as well.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah.
First of all, I'm very sorry that I came late, because people are so different.
Yeah, that's a very excellent point, and that's why I think you do have to understand this at a more abstract level, meaning we're not looking at specifics. For example, I may hate something, but you may love it. So for me to say I'm not going to do something for you because I don't like it, that would be narcissistic and egotistical. But it means, in a more general way, just as I would not want somebody to disrespect my wishes and my desires and my preferences, I need to be sensitive to your desires and your preferences. So it's not the same thing.
It would be good to say that.
Well, the gates of interpretation are always open. It certainly is a legitimate interpretation of that language. Now, let me just mention, though, a related question, and that is, people do ask, why does Hillel express things in the negative? Right? What you don't want, do not do to somebody what you don't want to be done to you. Why doesn't he talk about do unto others, the positive golden rule, or Rabbi Akiva? Rabbi Akiva, who didn't make it up, Rabbi Akiva is quoting the Torah. The Ahavta, you should love your friend as you love yourself. Why, as it were, is it phrased in the negative? Now, Christian scholars actually make a point about this. Hillel and Yashka are roughly contemporaneous, and they say, you see how deficient Pharisaic, the Pharisees are our guys, the Chachamim, the Prushim, how deficient Pharisaic morality is compared to the morality of Yashka. Because the most Hillel can come up with is, don't hurt somebody. Don't do something bad to people. But Yashka went so much further. Love your neighbor as you love yourself. Yashka invented, they say, the ethic of love, not just don't hurt. Well, that's ridiculous. It is very true that Yashka did say, love your friend or love your neighbor as you love yourself, but Yashka is quoting a pasuk in Vayikra. The Torah says it. It's in the Torah. It wasn't made up by Jesus in any way. In fact, they say there's a lot of good stuff in Christianity, but it all came from Judaism. What did they say? Somebody once said to a speaker, he says, everything you said was good and new. But the problem is the part that was good was not new, and the part that was new was not good. So we could say the same thing about Christianity. You know, Christianity is good and new, but the good is not new and the new is not good, but it's new and good. So V'ahavta lecha kamocha is in the Torah. So that really strengthens the question, you know, why does Hillel use the negative instead of the positive? And
More realistic.
Well, number one, it can be more realistic. It also can be more difficult sometimes.
Right.
See,
With your wife.
yeah, there was a campaign, maybe it still goes on in different guises, for tzedakah, in which somebody was trying to say you should give tzedakah because they say you should look at the ani who needs tzedakah like a pair of tefillin, like a lulav and an esrog. This is your ticket to olam haba. This is how you get merit by helping the ani. He is your chefza shel mitzvah. He is your mitzvah object. Now, this was a well-intentioned campaign. I am not disparaging it. But in many, many ways, that's a very, very destructive attitude. Because it is simply dehumanizing people by looking them as objects by which I'll get my olam haba. And it doesn't look at the person's humanity. It doesn't look at them as a tselem elokim. It doesn't look at them as someone who is intrinsically valuable. To quote Martin Buber, which I normally don't consider a makor or anything, but he talked about the notion that in a true relationship, there's an I thou rather than an I it. I thou meaning I'm me and you're you, and I relate to you in the fullness of your being. And you're not simply an object. Again, it reminds. Okay, there's another bad joke. I'll save for another time. But okay. So the thing is, in fact, the Alter Slobodka used to say, people ask a question: why don't we recite a bracha on mitzvos bein adam lechaveiro? Right? Before I put on tefillin, I make a bracha. Before I light Shabbos candles, I make a bracha. Before I light Hanukkah candles, I make a bracha. Before I hear shofar, before I take lulav, before I sit in the sukkah, or when I sit in the sukkah. Why don't I make a bracha before I bring my parents a cup of tea? Asher kiddishanu b'mitzvosav v'tzivanu al kibud avayim. Why don't I make a bracha before I give tzedakah? Asher kiddishanu b'mitzvosav v'tzivanu lases tzedakah. So says the Sfas Emes and the Alter Slobodka, a very, very interesting idea. When you say the words, I am doing this because God commanded me to do it, you're implying that the only reason I'm doing it is because God commanded me. Now that's appropriate for Bein Adam L'Makom. I'm taking a lulav only because God commanded it. If God wouldn't command it, I'd have no reason to do it. But when you're dealing with an interpersonal mitzvah, you shouldn't be doing it because God says, hey, mom and dad, here's a cup of tea because God said I got to do it. No, that's not the attitude. The attitude is, I need to want to do it. I want to become a person who cares, number one, about my parents. I care about poor people who are suffering. I want to do it. In a way, making the bracha asher kiddishanu b'mitzvosav would be a denigration of what Bein Adam L'Chaveiro is about. Because Bein Adam L'Chaveiro is about inculcating and developing within our personalities compassion, kindness, rachamim. I'm not doing it because it's a mitzvah. I'm doing it because this is how I should feel. And of course, it's Hashem's will that I should feel that way. But it should become a feeling. It shouldn't just be. That's why there's a story they tell, a Hasidic story they tell. And I don't know if it's true. I even doubt that it's true. And some people absolutely hate the story. But it makes a very interesting point in a kind of a bizarre way. And based on what I just said, it would seem that the story is wrong. They tell the story about a Hasidic Rabbi who was extremely generous with tzedakah. He did not allow a penny to remain in his house. Every single thing he got from people was given to aniyim, always, always, always. And then one day, all of a sudden, he stopped giving. He wouldn't give a kopek to anybody. And people didn't understand. He just refused. He wouldn't help anybody no matter what it was. And this went on for 6 months. And after 6 months, he then resumed his giving pattern exactly the way it was and even more generously. So people didn't understand what was this 6-month hiatus. So he said the following. He said, my nature is I care for people. I feel. And I was giving tzedakah because I felt rachamim. But then I said, I'm not serving Hashem. I'm just giving in to my feelings. So I wanted to make myself cruel and unfeeling. I wanted to stop caring. And only when I obliterated my feelings of care and compassion, I then said, now I'm going to do exactly what I did for the sake of serving Hashem. This is the story, meaning he felt, the story, again, I suspect the story is not true, but according to the story, he felt when I'm acting out of feeling and compassion, that is somehow defective because you're not doing it for Hashem. But as I say, what the Alter of Slobodka and the Sfas Emes are teaching us is, it's the other way around. Hashem wants you to develop those feelings. Okay? And the Rambam says this many, many times. In fact, the Rambam points out a fascinating idea that the goal of giving tzedakah is not only the help that you're giving, but it's the character that you're building. Now, this is interesting because one could have made the argument that the only thing that's important is the act, but if you have the character, you'll do the act. But all we care about is the act. In fact, that's what the Hasidic story indicated. The Rambam says no. Tzedakah is about building character. In fact, the Rambam has a fascinating hypothetical. Let's say you have $1,000, I'll use dollars, shekel, $1,000 to give. So is it better to give $1,000 to one cause or to give $1 to 1,000 causes? So the Rambam says character, midos, is built by repetitive small actions. So your character is formed much more by giving $1 1,000 times than by giving one big donation. And therefore the Rambam says, in terms of character building, repetitive actions are more important than one big dramatic action. Now, the reason why I say in terms of character building is, I don't think that the Rambam is necessarily meant to be a halachic directive because of the following. Because obviously, when I'm contemplating what I should do with my tzedakah, so should I give 2 shekels to 1 million people who are begging? Or should I give $1,000 to a yeshiva, to a cause? Now, obviously, if you're asking where will my money do the most good, giving a shekel to 1,000 people, it's not going to accomplish that much. So I think what the Rambam is suggesting is there are 2 different goals you have in your tzedakah giving, and you have to figure out how to allocate them. One is I give tzedakah to develop my midos. The other is I give tzedakah to help people. Now, legabe, the helping people, it might be better to give more money to a limited number of people instead of a tiny bit to a lot of people. In terms of character building, the repetitive actions are greater. So what is being suggested here, although I'm not giving you a specific guideline, is that you divide your tzedakah between tzedakah for the purpose of developing my midos, and tzedakah for the purpose of doing the good that my money can do. And it could very well be that the Rambam is not referring to that second aspect. The Rambam might very well be moda that there is an important part of tzedakah to put your money where it can have a maximum effect, but some of your money should be allocated to character building. Yeah.
Right or no?
Well, the halacha actually is that if someone asks you directly, you give them something, but it can be very, very minimal. That is the halacha. But if somebody is simply there and didn't directly say words to you, so you're allowed to pass them by. Again, in modern society, it gets more and more difficult because there are so many people anywhere you go in Yerushalayim, particularly in the Kotel, and the like. And some are makel when you have a legitimate suspicion that they may not be fully honest. You can hold back unless they ask for food. It's very interesting. Halacha says if somebody directly asks for food, you got to somehow get it to them, because God forbid somebody could drop dead of starvation. But anything short of that, if someone might not be honest, some say there is a heter for this. Yeah.
Really needs the money.
Yeah, that would be approved, because only on Purim we have that special rule. Yeah. And by the way, Rav Chaim Kanievsky also paskins that for mail solicitation or emails now, that's not considered face-to-face, meaning the fact that I get a mail, mail, asking for money, that's not the same as turning somebody away who I meet in the street. Okay. All right. I'm totally forgot what I was talking about. Where am I?
You said you weren't going to be inspirational, but you were. You said,
accidents happen. They tell the story about, in fact, this week, maybe I'll talk about it more next week, but this week is the yahrzeit of actually both Rav Kook and Rav Meir Simcha, the Or Sameach. And maybe next week I'll talk more about it. But they tell the story that, Rav Meir Simcha of Dvinsk was the Rav of the Misnagdim, of the non-Hasidim in Dvinsk, and the Rogatchover Gaon, Rav Yosef Rosen, super genius, was the Hasidic Rav. And they had very, very different personalities. It's a fascinating study in contrast. Rav Meir Simcha was very, very soft and gentle. The Rogatchover was stormy and tempestuous. Like you'd be scared to be in his presence. But the story was they were once learning together, and they came to different conclusions. So the Rogatchover said, there's a passage from the Sma, Sefer Mir Sinayim, a commentary on Choshen Mishpat, that says that the opinion of a balabas, the opinion of a layperson, is always the opposite of the Torah's view. Whatever, it's taken out of context. But so the Rogatchover said, let's ask the man in the street what he thinks. And whatever he says, the truth will be the opposite. So they stop a balabas, they ask him for his opinion, and the balabas says, just like the Rogatchover. So Rav Meir Simcha says, you see, I'm right, because if what the balabas says is the opposite of the Torah, he says, and he says like you, so I'm right. So the Rogatchover says, even the balabas has a bad day sometimes. So today,
it was not a bad day.
I was not planning, but okay, beseder. All right, so we're really in the middle of a sugya, but okay, Baruch Hashem. I mean, again, just to remind you not to get totally lost, we were discussing the idea of Birkat Hamazon, D'Oraisa, D'Rabbanan. We were discussing D'Rabbanans, and then we branched off. I'm going to have to try to remember exactly how I branched off, but we're going to get back. Our sugya right now is still Birkat Hamazon, D'Oraisa, D'Rabbanan. We will come back to it. Okay. Anyway, a Chodesh Tov and a good week.